What if the ancient builders who shaped the hardest stones on Earth didn't carve them at all, but poured them like wet clay into moulds that have long since rotted away? In the high Andes, where oxygen thins and cold bites through wool, stone walls still stand with joints so precise that not even a blade of grass can find purchase between them. Walls whose surfaces show no chisel marks, no quarry scars, no evidence of the brutal labour such precision should demand. What if the knowledge required to soften granite, to liquefy basalt, to reshape andesite like bread dough, was once common enough to be recorded on tablets that still survive in museum basements? Tablets describing plant extracts and mineral compounds that modern chemistry has never successfully replicated? So before the silence of these stones pulls you under, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, only if you're drawn to histories where the evidence refuses to fit the story we've been told. And if you're still listening, leave a comment telling me where you are and what time it is there. I'd like to imagine this quiet stretching across the world as old questions echo through the dark. Above the city of Cusco, where the air thins and the sky deepens to a blue that feels almost artificial in its intensity, there stands a wall that should not exist. The fortress of Sacsayhuaman rises from the Andean plateau at an elevation of 300 meters, its massive stones fitted together with a precision that modern engineers struggle to explain and have never successfully replicated. The largest of these stones weighs more than 200 tons, roughly the weight of a commercial airliner, and it sits flush against its neighbours with tolerances measured in fractions of a millimetre. No mortar binds these blocks, no cement fills the joints. The stones hold themselves in place through geometry alone, through surfaces so precisely matched that the weight of each block locks it permanently against its neighbours, creating a structure that has survived 5 centuries of earthquakes in one of the most seismically active regions on Earth. When the Spanish conquistadors first encountered Sacsayhuaman in 1533, they assumed it must have been built by demons. They had no other framework for understanding how such massive stones could have been moved, shaped, and fitted with such impossible accuracy by a civilization that possessed no iron tools, no wheeled vehicles, and no written language capable of recording architectural plans. The walls they saw were already ancient by Inca standards, attributed in local tradition not to human builders, but to an earlier age when the world operated under different rules, when stones could be made soft and workable through methods that had been lost before living memory began. The Spanish dismissed these traditions as primitive superstition, the confused mythology of a conquered people attempting to explain achievements they could no longer understand, but the walls remained, and the questions they posed did not fade with the empire that built them. In 1911, an American historian named Hiram Bingham III arrived in Peru searching for the lost city of Vilcabamba, the final refuge of Inca resistance against Spanish rule. What he found instead was Machu Picchu, and his explorations brought him repeatedly to Sacsayhuaman, where the stonework forced him to reconsider everything he thought he knew about ancient construction. Bingham was no romantic. He had trained at Yale and Harvard, had served as a lecturer in South American history, and approached his subject with the empirical skepticism of an academic institution that prided itself on rational inquiry. But standing before those walls, running his fingers along joints so tight that a sheet of paper could not be inserted between the stones, Bingham found himself writing observations that he knew his colleagues would struggle to accept. The precision was too perfect, the scale was too vast. The evidence of conventional construction methods was entirely absent. Where were the quarry marks that should scar every surface of stones torn from bedrock with the bronze tools? Where were the drag marks and roller impressions that should line every approach route if these 200-ton blocks had been hauled up the mountainside on wooden sledges? Where were the mounds of stone chips and debris that should accumulate wherever masons spend years shaping granite with handheld pounders? The archaeological record showed none of this. The stones sat in their positions as if they had grown there, as if they had been poured into moulds and allowed to harden into the place, as if the very concept of carving and transport was somehow irrelevant to their creation. Bingham documented what he saw but offered no explanation. The questions he raised in his journals and published accounts have never been satisfactorily answered, and the walls of Sacsayhuaman continue to trouble every engineer, geologist, and archaeologist who examines them closely enough to recognize what they represent. Consider the 12-angle stone. In the heart of Cusco, built into a wall that once formed part of an Inca palace, there sits a single block of green diorite that fits perfectly against 12 neighbouring stones. Not 5, not 6, but 12 separate surfaces, each cut at a different angle, each mated precisely to the corresponding face of an adjacent block, and the entire assembly locked together without mortar, without pins, without any visible mechanism of attachment. Diorite is one of the hardest stones on Earth, ranking near granite on the Mohs scale, harder than any tool the Inca supposedly possessed. Bronze chisels would have blunted against it within minutes. Stone hammers would have shattered before making significant impressions. Yet here sits a block with 12 precisely angled faces, each polished to a surface finish that reflects light evenly, each fitted to its neighbours with tolerances that would challenge a modern machine shop equipped with diamond cutting tools and computer numerical control. The conventional explanation involves patience. Generations of skilled masons, we are told, spent decades pecking away at each stone with handheld pounders made of harder material, gradually shaping the surfaces through millions of individual impacts until the desired form emerged. Sand and water were used to polish the final surfaces. Wooden levers and earthen ramps were used to transport and position the finished blocks. The Inca had time, the argument goes, centuries of labour to invest in structures that served both practical and ceremonial functions. But this explanation, comforting as it might be to those who require ancient peoples to fit within familiar categories of technological development, fails to account for what the stones themselves reveal. In 1986, archaeologist Jean-Pierre Protzen of the University of California, Berkeley, travelled to Ollantaytambo, another Inca site famous for its megalithic construction, to test the conventional theory through experimental archaeology. Protzen was not a skeptic seeking to prove that ancient methods were impossible. He was a rigorous academic who wanted to demonstrate exactly how the Inca had achieved their remarkable stonework using the tools and techniques that mainstream archaeology attributed to them. He collected river cobbles of the type traditionally identified as Inca stone hammers. He selected blocks of andesite similar to those used in Inca walls. He recruited local workers familiar with traditional stoneworking methods, and he spent months systematically attempting to replicate the precision visible in the structures surrounding him. Protzen achieved partial success. He demonstrated that river cobbles could indeed be used to shape andesite, that patient hammering could produce flat surfaces, that the basic principles of Inca stone fitting were achievable through conventional means. His work became a cornerstone of the mainstream archaeological position that Inca stonework, however impressive, required no extraordinary technology. But Protzen was honest enough to document his failures as well as his successes. He could not replicate the perfectly curved surfaces that appear throughout Inca architecture, and he could not achieve the sub-millimeter tolerances visible in the finest stonework. He could not explain how masons working with handheld tools could have produced surfaces so regular that they appear to have been shaped by mechanical means, and most troublingly, he could not reproduce the peculiar surface finish that characterizes so many Inca stones. A glassy, almost vitrified appearance that suggests the stone was somehow melted or glazed, rather than simply polished. Modern geologists who have examined these surfaces under magnification have noted anomalies that do not match the expected results of mechanical abrasion. The crystalline structure of the outermost layer differs from the underlying stone, as if extreme heat had been applied to the surface before it cooled. Small bubbles and flow patterns are visible in some samples, features that would only form if the stone had been liquid at some point during its processing. These observations remain controversial, explained away by some researchers as natural weathering patterns or contamination from later applications, but they accumulate in the archaeological literature like questions that refuse to be dismissed. And then there is the problem of the joints themselves. The stones at Sacsayhuaman and dozens of other Inca sites are not cut in simple geometric shapes that would be easy to fit together. They're irregular polygons, their faces curved and angled in complex three-dimensional surfaces that interlock like puzzle pieces in a puzzle designed by someone with complete disregard for the limitations of conventional geometry. Each stone fits only in its specific position in the wall. Each surface mates only with its corresponding partner. If you removed a single block and attempted to place it elsewhere in the structure, it would not fit, because its shape was determined by the shapes of the stones around it, or the shapes of the stones around it were determined by its shape, or somehow all of the shapes were determined simultaneously by a process that exceeds anything achievable through trial and error, fitting with multi-ton blocks of granite. Think about what that means in practical terms. If you were building a wall using conventional methods, you would shape your stones to some standardized form, rectangles or squares or regular polygons that could be fitted together in predictable patterns. This is how walls have been built throughout history, from the pyramids of Egypt to the cathedrals of medieval Europe. Standardization reduces complexity. It allows workers to prepare stones in advance, to know before they arrive at the construction site exactly how each block will fit into the larger structure. But the Inca builders did something different. They created stones whose shapes seem to have been determined by the specific context in which they would be placed. Curves that follow the curves of their neighbours, angles that complement the angles of adjacent blocks, surfaces that mate so perfectly that modern laser scanning reveals gaps measured in thousandths of an inch. Either the masons shaped each stone individually, repeatedly lifting and lowering 200-ton blocks to test their fit, while making incremental adjustments through millions of hammer blows, a process that would have required centuries for a single wall, or they possessed some method of shaping stone that we have not identified, some technique that allowed them to adjust the form of already positioned blocks, to reshape surfaces in place, to achieve the kind of precision that modern construction achieves only through computer-controlled machinery, operating on materials specifically engineered for dimensional stability. The largest stones at Sacsayhuaman weigh more than 300 tons. The quarries from which they were extracted lie kilometers away, cross-terrain that includes ravines, rivers, and slopes that would challenge modern heavy transport equipment. No evidence of the roads, ramps, or cleared pathways that such transport would require has ever been found. No evidence of the rollers, sledges, or hauling apparatus that would have been necessary to move such masses has ever been recovered. The stones sit in their walls as if they materialized there, as if the distance between quarry and construction site was somehow irrelevant to their placement. Spanish chroniclers who interviewed Inca elders in the decades following the conquest recorded explanations that sounded to European ears like obvious mythology. The old ones knew how to soften stone, the elders said. They possessed knowledge of certain plants and minerals that could make rock as workable as clay. They could pour stone into molds, shape it with their hands, allow it to harden into forms that would endure for ages. The Spanish recorded these accounts but did not believe them. They assumed the conquered people were exaggerating or lying, or simply confused about their own history. But the accounts were remarkably consistent, reported from different regions by different chroniclers who had no communication with each other, and they described techniques that, if they had ever existed, would explain precisely the anomalies that continue to puzzle modern researchers. In the 1980s, material scientist Joseph Davidovits began examining pyramid stones from Egypt using scanning electron microscopy and X-ray diffraction analysis. What he found challenged the fundamental assumption that the pyramids were built from quarried limestone. The chemical composition of certain pyramid blocks did not match the composition of stone from any known Egyptian quarry. The crystalline structure showed anomalies consistent with synthetic production rather than natural formation. Air bubbles and organic inclusions appeared in samples that should have been solid stone if they had been carved from natural bedrock. Davidovits proposed that at least some pyramid stones were not quarried and transported but cast in place, mixed from limestone powder, water and natron salt to form a geopolymer concrete that hardened into artificial stone indistinguishable from natural material except under laboratory analysis. His theory remains controversial, vigorously disputed by Egyptologists who defend the conventional quarrying hypothesis, but the laboratory evidence he compiled has never been successfully refuted. And it raises an obvious question. If ancient Egyptians possessed the knowledge to create artificial formed stone, could other ancient civilizations have possessed similar or related techniques? Could the Inca traditions of softening stone reflect not primitive superstition, but actual technical knowledge preserved in distorted form through centuries of oral transmission? Could the impossible joints at Sacsayhuaman have been created not through superhuman labour within inadequate tools, but through chemical or thermal processes that modern archaeology has not yet identified? The surfaces of many Inca stones show a peculiar characteristic that researchers have struggled to explain. Viewed under magnification, the outermost layer appears different from the stone beneath it, as if a thin shell of altered material covered the original rock. This layer is harder and more reflect than the underlying stone, and its presence is consistent with what would result if extreme heat had been applied to the surface, partially melting the outermost molecules before they cooled into a glassy skin. Some researchers have proposed that the Inca used fire and water to thermally shock stone surfaces, weakening the material and making it easier to work. But thermal shocking would leave characteristic fracture patterns that are not visible in the finest stonework. And it would not explain the glazed appearance of surfaces that show no fracturing at all, surfaces that look as if they had been softened, shaped, and allowed to harden into forms determined by the hands of their makers. In 1983, researcher Jorge Lira published his analysis of a plant he called the yotcha, an Andean species whose sap he claimed could soften stone sufficiently to allow it to be shaped by hand. Lira reported that indigenous elders had demonstrated the technique to him, applying the plant extract to stone samples and then moulding the softened material before it rehardened. His claims were dismissed by the scientific establishment as unsupported by rigorous evidence, and attempts to identify the specific plant he described have produced conflicting results. But Lira was not the first to record such traditions. Spanish colonial chroniclers described similar techniques centuries earlier, and comparable accounts appear in the oral histories of multiple Andean communities with no documented contact with each other. The consistency of these traditions across time and geography suggests that they preserve some genuine historical memory, even if that memory has been distorted or exaggerated through generations of retelling. What we know with certainty is this: the walls of Sacsayhuaman exist. The 12-angle stone in Cusco exists, the polygonal masonry at Ollantaytambo and Pisac and dozens of other Inca sites exists. These structures display precision that exceeds anything achievable through the methods conventionally attributed to their builders. They show surface characteristics that suggest processes we have not identified. They were created by a civilization that consistently described itself not as the inventor of its most impressive techniques, but as the inheritor of knowledge that came from an earlier time, from an older people, from sources that the Inca themselves could not fully explain. The conventional narrative tells us that ancient peoples were limited by their technology, that Bronze Age civilizations could only achieve what Bronze Age tools allowed, that impressive monuments required nothing more than abundant labour and unlimited time. But the stones at Sacsayhuaman do not fit this narrative. They sit in their walls as they have sat for 5 centuries, weathering earthquakes that have toppled colonial churches and modern buildings, their joints still tight, their surfaces still showing that strange glazed quality that no researcher has satisfactorily explained. Either our understanding of what was possible for ancient builders is fundamentally incomplete, or we have lost knowledge that was once common, techniques that were once practiced openly, methods that allowed human hands to shape the hardest stone as easily as a potter shapes wet clay. The evidence does not tell us which explanation is correct, it simply accumulates patient and undeniable, waiting for someone to find the questions that will finally unlock its meaning. And perhaps that is the most unsettling aspect of these impossible walls. They do not hide their mystery, they display it openly, fitted together in plain sight, challenging every visitor to explain what seems inexplicable, to account for precision that seems impossible, to accept that the ancient world may have known things that we, for all our technological advancement, have somehow forgotten. In 1979, a French chemist named Joseph Davidovits stood before an audience of materials scientists at a conference in Miami and proposed something that should have ended his academic career. The pyramids of Egypt, he argued, were not built from quarried limestone at all, or at least not entirely. A significant portion of the stone blocks that comprise these monuments were cast in place, mixed from crucite limestone powder, water, natron salt and lime, to form a calcium-based geopolymer that hardened into artificial stone indistinguishable from natural material except under laboratory analysis. The audience response was predictable. Egyptologists who had spent decades documenting quarry sites and transport routes did dismiss the theory immediately. Geologists pointed to the visible bedding planes in pyramid blocks, the fossil shells embedded in the limestone, the obvious characteristics of sedimentary rock laid down over millions of years. The theory was filed alongside the countless other alternative explanations that the pyramids seemed to attract, interesting perhaps to those outside the field but not worthy of serious scientific consideration. But Davidovits was not a fringe theorist seeking attention. He held a doctorate in chemistry from the University of Strasbourg and had spent years developing geopolymer technology for industrial applications. He understood the chemistry of mineral binding at a level that most of his critics did not, and he had developed his pyramid hypothesis not from speculation about ancient mysteries, but from laboratory observation of materials that behaved in ways the conventional narrative could not explain. What Davidovits noticed first was the density variation. Natural limestone quarried from bedrock has consistent density throughout because the sedimentary layers that formed it were compressed uniformly over geological time. But the limestone blocks in certain pyramid structures showed density patterns that varied from top to bottom within individual blocks, denser at the base where material would have settled under gravity, less dense at the top where lighter components would have migrated during a liquid or plastic phase. This is exactly what you would expect if the blocks had been poured rather than carved, if they had existed for some period in a state fluid enough for gravitational separation to occur. Then there were the air bubbles. Natural limestone does not contain air bubbles because it formed under conditions of immense pressure at the bottom of the ancient seas. But Davidovits found spherical voids in pyramid limestone samples that could only have formed if gas had been trapped during a casting process. Bubbles that rose through a viscous mixture before it hardened, leaving permanent records of their passage frozen in the stone. The presence of these bubbles was difficult to explain through any conventional formation process, but they made perfect sense if the material had been mixed, poured, and allowed to solidify in the manner Davidovits proposed. Perhaps most striking were the organic inclusions. In samples from the Giza Plateau, Davidovits identified fibres, hairs, and fragments of material that appeared to be organic in origin, embedded within what was supposed to be solid sedimentary rock hundreds of millions of years old. Natural limestone cannot contain such inclusions because it formed long before any organisms capable of producing hair or fibre existed on Earth. But if the blocks were cast from a mixture prepared by ancient workers, such contamination would be not only possible but expected, the inevitable result of human labour in a time before cleanroom protocols and industrial hygiene standards. In 1988, Davidovits presented his chemical analysis to the American Chemical Society, laying out the evidence in the precise technical language of material science. He showed X-ray diffraction patterns that indicated the presence of amorphous phases not found in natural limestone. He presented scanning electron microscope images of microstructures inconsistent with sedimentary formation. He documented chemical compositions that diverged significantly from limestone samples taken directly from the Tura and Mokattam quarries that mainstream Egyptology identified as the source of pyramid construction material. The response from the archaeological establishment was not engagement but dismissal. Egyptologists who lacked the technical training to evaluate his chemical evidence rejected it on procedural grounds, arguing that his samples were improperly collected, his methods were inappropriate for archaeological materials, and his conclusions were motivated by a desire to overturn established knowledge rather than a genuine pursuit of truth. The controversy settled into a familiar pattern, one side citing laboratory data, the other side citing institutional authority, and neither side persuading the other. For nearly 2 decades, the geopolymer hypothesis remained in this state of suspended evaluation, neither proven nor definitively refuted, surviving on the margins of scholarly discourse while the mainstream narrative continued unchanged. Then in 2006, something unexpected happened. Professor Michel Barsoum of Drexel University in Philadelphia, a materials scientist with no prior involvement in pyramid controversies and no stake in overturning conventional Egyptology, decided to examine pyramid limestone samples using scanning electron microscopy, simply to satisfy his own curiosity about a question that had bothered him since reading about Davidovits and his work. Barsoum expected to find natural limestone. He expected his analysis would confirm the conventional position and allow him to dismiss the geopolymer hypothesis as an interesting but ultimately incorrect theory. What he found instead changed his position entirely. Under high magnification, Barsoum observed silicon dioxide nanospheres in the pyramid limestone, spherical particles of amorphous silica measuring only billionths of a meter in diameter. Natural limestone does not contain silicon dioxide nanospheres because there is no natural process by which they could form within calcium carbonate sediment. But geopolymer reactions produce exactly such particles as a byproduct of the alkali activation of silicates, nanospheres, that form when silicon compounds dissolve and precipitate during the chemical hardening process. Their presence in pyramid samples was, in Barsoum's assessment, a chemical signature that could not be explained by any natural formation pathway. Barsoum also observed what he described as a transition zone between the limestone matrix and the embedded fossil shells, a boundary layer where the chemistry changed gradually rather than abruptly, as would be expected if natural limestone had simply incorporated pre-existing shells during sedimentary deposition. This transition zone was consistent with a reconstituted material, a stone that had been broken down and reformed around the shells rather than a stone that had grown naturally around them over geological time. The implications were significant enough that Barsoom felt compelled to publish his findings, even knowing the controversy that would follow. His paper appeared in the Journal of the American Ceramic Society, a peer-reviewed publication with no particular interest in archaeological debates, selected specifically because its editorial process would evaluate his work on technical merit, rather than its implications for established historical narratives. The peer reviewers, materials scientists rather than Egyptologists, found no fault with his methodology or his data. The paper was accepted and published, placing laboratory evidence for the geopolymer hypothesis into the formal scientific literature for the first time. The archaeological response was revealing. Rather than engaging with the chemical evidence on its own terms, prominent Egyptologists attacked the implications. The pyramids could not have been cast from geopolymer concrete, they argued, because we know how the pyramids were built, because we have documented the quarries and the ramps and the labour organisation, because accepting an alternative construction method would undermine decades of scholarly work that had painstakingly reconstructed the social and economic systems of ancient Egypt. The circularity of this argument seems not to have troubled those who made it. We know the evidence is wrong because we already know the answer, and we know the answer because we have interpreted other evidence in light of assumptions that the chemical data now calls into question. This is not how science is supposed to work, but it is often how scientific institutions behave when confronted with findings that threaten established frameworks. In 2011, additional confirmation came from an unexpected source. A team of researchers, including geologists, chemists, and materials scientists, published a comprehensive analysis in the Journal of the American Ceramic Society, examining both pyramid samples and control samples from identified quarry sites. Their findings supported and extended Barsoom's observations. The pyramid blocks showed chemical and microstructural characteristics that the quarry samples did not: variations in composition, anomalous mineral phases, and organisational patterns consistent with synthetic rather than natural formation. The researchers were careful to note that their findings did not prove the entire pyramid was cast from geopolymer material. The evidence suggested that casting may have been used for certain blocks or certain portions of the structure, particularly the precisely fitted casing stones that originally covered the pyramid exterior, while conventional quarried blocks may have comprised the bulk of the interior mass. This nuanced conclusion offered a potential reconciliation between the chemical evidence and the archaeological evidence, allowing for the possibility that ancient Egyptian builders used multiple techniques, selecting different methods for different applications based on the requirements of each situation. But what made this evidence particularly significant for understanding anomalous stonework worldwide was its implications for the broader question of ancient technological knowledge. If Egyptian builders possessed the chemical understanding necessary to create synthetic stone more than 4,000 years ago, then the categorical dismissal of similar claims from other cultures becomes much more difficult to sustain. The Inca traditions of stone softening no longer appear as primitive superstition, but as potential parallels to documented Egyptian capabilities. The precision of Sacsay Huaman no longer requires supernatural explanation or impossibly sophisticated machining. It requires only the possibility that Andean cultures possessed related but distinct chemical knowledge that may have been lost when the transmission chains that preserved it were broken by conquest, disease, and the systematic destruction of indigenous intellectual traditions. The plant kingdom connection becomes crucial here, because if ancient stoneworking techniques relied on organic compounds, then the knowledge could disappear completely within a few generations of disruption. Unlike techniques that depend on durable tools or permanent infrastructure, botanical knowledge exists only in living human memory and in the continued availability of the plants themselves. When populations collapse, when ecosystems are disrupted, when the social structures that support specialized knowledge are destroyed, plant-based technologies vanish without leaving physical traces. The Spanish chroniclers who documented Inca culture in the decades following the conquest recorded consistent accounts of plant-based stone softening from sources across the former empire. Garcilaso de la Vega, the son of a Spanish conquistador and an Inca princess, wrote in his royal commentaries of the Incas that the indigenous people possessed knowledge of a certain herb whose juice softened stone so that it could be fitted perfectly against other stones. He described this not as mythology, but as practical technique, knowledge that had been lost within living memory as the social systems that transmitted it collapsed under colonial rule. Similar accounts appear in the chronicles of Pedro de Cieza de Leon, Bernabe Cobo, and other Spanish observers who had no contact with each other and no motivation to fabricate consistent falsehoods about Inca technology. The convergence of their accounts suggests they were documenting something real, some aspect of indigenous knowledge that multiple observers encountered independently. In 1906, Colonel Percy Harrison Fawcett, a British surveyor conducting boundary expeditions in the remote interior of Bolivia, recorded an observation that has puzzled researchers ever since. Fawcett described birds that excavated nesting cavities in solid cliff faces using plant extracts, species that carried leaves of a particular plant to the rock surface and rubbed them against the stone until it softened sufficiently to be pecked away. He reported that indigenous guides identified the plant and explained that it was used in stoneworking, though they would not reveal the specific techniques or the locations where the plant could be found. Fawcett was not a credulous observer prone to accepting folk beliefs without scrutiny. He was a trained surveyor with the Royal Geographical Society, experienced in distinguishing reliable information from local exaggeration. His account of the stone-softening birds and plants appears in his private journals alongside careful observations of geography, tribal customs, and botanical specimens that have been independently verified. If he was fabricating or mistaken about the stone-softening plants, he showed no similar tendency toward fabrication or error in his other observations. The problem is that no one has conclusively identified the plant Fawcett described. Various researchers have proposed candidates including species containing oxalic acid, compounds known to affect calcium-based minerals, but none has been demonstrated to produce the dramatic softening effect that Fawcett and the Spanish chroniclers described. This failure to identify the plant has been cited as evidence that the accounts were exaggerated or false, but it might equally indicate that the plant itself has become rare or extinct, that the specific preparation methods are unknown, or that the active compounds require combinations of factors that modern researchers have not replicated. Oxalic acid provides a starting point for understanding how plant-based stone softening might work chemically. This compound, found in high concentrations in plants like sorrel, rhubarb, and various Andean species, reacts with calcium to form calcium oxalate, a softer and more workite substance than the original calcium carbonate of limestone or the calcium silicates of granite. Concentrated oxalic acid applied to stone surfaces initiates a chemical transformation that extends gradually into the material, weakening the crystal structure and allowing the softened layer to be removed or reshaped. Modern conservation scientists use dilute oxalic acid solutions to clean calcium-based stone, and they handle these solutions with care because prolonged contact can damage the very surfaces they are trying to preserve. But oxalic acid alone does not explain the rapid dramatic softening described in traditional accounts. Something else would need to be involved: additional compounds that accelerate the reaction, catalysts that lower the activation energy, or preparation methods that concentrate the active ingredients beyond what occurs naturally in plant tissues. Jorge Lira, a Peruvian scholar who spent decades researching traditional Andean technologies, claimed to have witnessed stone-softening demonstrations by indigenous practitioners and to have partially identified the plants and methods involved. He described a reddish liquid derived from multiple plant sources that produced measurable softening of stone samples within hours, rather than the days or weeks that oxalic acid alone would require. Lira published his findings in Spanish-language journals that received limited international circulation, and his work has never been successfully replicated by researchers working from his published accounts. Whether this reflects inadequacies in his documentation, deliberate withholding of crucial details by his indigenous sources, or fundamental errors in his observations remains unclear. What is clear is that the ethnobotanical knowledge of Andean cultures has been catastrophically depleted since the Spanish conquest. The combination of population collapse from European diseases, the suppression of indigenous religious and technical practices, the destruction of the Quipu record-keeping system, and the ecological disruption caused by colonial land use patterns created conditions under which specialized botanical knowledge could disappear within a few generations. Plants that may have been cultivated or carefully managed for their stone softening properties could have become rare or extinct. Preparation methods that required specific timing, specific combinations, or specific ritual contexts could have been lost when the practitioners died without transmitting their knowledge. The social structures that identified promising apprentices, that validated correct technique, and that preserved knowledge across generations could have collapsed so completely that recovery became impossible. This patterns of knowledge loss is not hypothetical. It has been documented in numerous other contexts where indigenous technical traditions have disappeared without leaving adequate records for reconstruction. The formula for Roman concrete, which enabled the construction of structures that have endured for 2,000 years, was lost so completely after the fall of Rome that it was only reconstructed in the 20th century through painstaking analysis of surviving samples. The metallurgical techniques that produced Damascus steel, famous for its combination of hardness, flexibility, and distinctive surface patterns, disappeared when the traditional supply chains for the specific ores required were disrupted, and modern researchers have struggled for decades to reproduce the material with complete accuracy. Greek fire, the incendiary weapon that defended the Byzantine Empire for centuries, was so secret that even Byzantine sources do not describe its composition, and we still do not know with certainty what it was or how it worked. If chemical knowledge can be lost from literate civilizations that produced extensive written records, how much more easily could it disappear from oral cultures whose knowledge systems depended entirely on living transmission? The geopolymer evidence from Egypt, the ethnobotanical accounts from the Andes, and the anomalous stonework visible at sites across the ancient world may all be pointing toward the same conclusion. Ancient peoples possessed sophisticated chemical knowledge that we have lost. Knowledge that enabled them to manipulate stone in ways that seem impossible given what we assume about their technological capabilities. This knowledge may have been transmitted through guild systems, priestly hierarchies, or family lineages that guarded their techniques as valuable secrets. It may have been encoded in symbolic forms that we cannot read, preserved in oral traditions that have been dismissed as mythology, or recorded on materials that have not survived. The specific techniques may have varied by region, adapted to local geology, local botany, and local cultural frameworks. Egyptian builders working with Nile Valley limestone may have developed geopolymer methods suited to their particular raw materials. Andean builders working with andesite and granite may have discovered plant-based compounds effective against silicate minerals. Both approaches would have produced similar results, stone shaped with precision that mechanical methods cannot easily explain, but through different chemical pathways reflecting different environmental conditions and different cultural developments. The implications extend beyond the question of how ancient monuments were built. If the knowledge once existed and was lost, then the loss itself will become significant. It suggests that technological progress is not inevitable, that capabilities once gained can be forgotten, that the accumulation of human knowledge is fragile and contingent rather than permanent and secure. It challenges the narrative of continuous advancement that shapes modern self-understanding. The assumption that we know more than our ancestors, that their apparent achievements must be explicable through methods inferior to our own. The stones at Sacsayhuaman and Giza do not care about our assumptions. They sit where they were placed, fitted together with precision that we cannot replicate, showing chemical signatures that we cannot entirely explain, waiting for someone to ask the right questions. Perhaps the answers lie in laboratory analysis of samples not yet collected. Perhaps they lie in ethnobotanical research among communities that still preserve fragments of traditional knowledge. Perhaps they lie in experimental archaeology that approaches the problem with genuine openness to unconventional methods rather than predetermined certainty about what ancient peoples could and could not achieve. Or perhaps some knowledge, once lost, is lost forever, leaving only the monuments themselves as evidence that something we do not understand was once possible. In 1828, a Dutch merchant purchased two papyrus manuscripts from an antiquities dealer in Egypt, documents that had been discovered together in an unnamed tomb in the Theban necropolis, and would eventually find their way to museums in Leiden and Stockholm where they remain today. The Leiden Papyrus X and the Stockholm Papyrus, as they came to be known, were written in Greek during the 3rd century of the Common Era, but they preserved knowledge that their anonymous author claimed derived from far older Egyptian sources, temple secrets passed down through generations of priests and craftsmen who had guarded their techniques for millennia. When scholars first translated these texts in the 19th century, They classified them immediately as alchemical nonsense, the delusional recipes of mystics seeking to transform base metals into gold through magical procedures that could never work. The texts described methods for colouring metals to resemble gold and silver, for creating artificial gemstones, for treating minerals to change their properties in ways that seemed fantastical to scientists trained in the emerging disciplines of modern chemistry. But as our understanding of ancient technology has deepened, these texts have begun to appear less fantastical and more like genuine technical manuals, their procedures corresponding to real chemical processes that actually produce the effects described. Their language obscure not because the authors were confused, but because they were protecting valuable trade secrets through deliberate obfuscation. Among the procedures preserved in these papyri are references to treating stone, to softening minerals, to making hard substances workable through the application of specific compounds prepared according to detailed recipes. The translations are contested and the interpretations uncertain, but the descriptions bear a troubling resemblance to the ethnobotanical accounts from the Andes and to the chemical evidence from Egyptian pyramid sites. If these texts preserve genuine technical knowledge, even in corrupted or incomplete form, they represent potential links in a chain of transmission stretching back to the pyramid builders themselves. Fragments of understanding that survived the collapse of ancient Egyptian civilization and the destruction of the great libraries that had preserved its accumulated wisdom. Pliny the Elder, writing in Rome during the 1st century of the Common Era, compiled what he called the Natural History, an encyclopedic survey of everything the ancient world knew about the natural world, from astronomy to zoology, from metallurgy to medicine. Among his thousands of observations and citations, Pliny describes techniques for treating stone that have puzzled classicists for centuries. He writes of stones made plastic, of minerals softened through the application of specific substances, of methods by which hard materials could be rendered temporarily workable before hardening again into permanent form. Modern translators have struggled with these passages, uncertain whether Pliny was describing literal chemical processes or using metaphorical language that his original readers would have understood differently than we do today. The problem is that Pliny was not himself a practitioner of the techniques he described. He was a compiler, gathering information from hundreds of sources, many of which no longer survive, and condensing their contents into summaries that omitted the practical details necessary for actual application. When he describes stone being made plastic, he does not specify which stones, which substances, which procedures, or how long the effect lasted. He provides just enough information to indicate that such techniques existed in his source material, but not enough for a modern researcher to reconstruct the methods. This frustrating pattern recurs throughout ancient technical literature. Authors describe effects without causes, results without procedures, possibilities without specifics. Whether this reflects deliberate secrecy, lost context, or the degradation of text through centuries of copying remains unclear. What is clear is that references to stoneworking techniques that exceed conventional mechanical methods appear repeatedly across the ancient Mediterranean world in sources that had no contact with each other and no motivation to fabricate consistent claims about technologies that would have been either commonplace or legendary depending on who you asked. Theophrastus, the student and successor of Aristotle, who led the Lyceum in Athens during the 4th century before the Common Era, wrote a treatise titled On Stones that represents the earliest systematic attempt to classify and describe minerals in the Western intellectual tradition. Among his observations, Theophrastus notes that certain stones respond to treatments that alter their hardness, their colour, or their workability. He describes stones that can be softened by heating, stones that change properties when exposed to specific liquids, stones that combine with other substances to form new materials with different characteristics. His language is careful and empirical, the product of a philosophical tradition that valued observation over speculation. But his references to stone alteration have been dismissed by most modern scholars as primitive misunderstanding of natural weathering processes, or at best as descriptions of superficial surface treatments that did not affect the underlying mineral structure. But Theophrastus was not naive about the difference between surface effects and structural changes. He distinguished clearly between alterations that affected only the outer layer of a stone, and those that penetrated throughout its mass. When he describes substances that soften stone, he appears to be describing genuine changes in mineral properties, changes that modern chemistry confirms are possible under the right conditions with the right reagents. The question is whether ancient practitioners had discovered these conditions empirically, through centuries of trial and error experimentation, and developed practical techniques that produced effects we can now explain theoretically, but cannot easily reproduce. The Arabic alchemical tradition preserved and extended Greek and Egyptian technical knowledge through the centuries following the Islamic conquest of the 7th century. While Europe descended into the fragmentation and intellectual contraction of the early medieval period, scholars in Baghdad, Cairo, Damascus, and Cordoba translated Greek manuscripts into Arabic, commented on their contents, and conducted their own experiments to verify and extend the techniques described. Names like Jabir ibn Hayyan, al-Razi, and Ibn Sina represent only the most famous figures in a Shumasest tradition that produced thousands of treatises on chemistry, metallurgy, and mineral processing. Many of these texts yet remain untranslated, preserved in manuscript collections across the Middle East and North Africa, their contents known only from brief descriptions in library catalogues. Among the techniques described in Arabic alchemical literature are procedures for treating stone, for dissolving minerals, for creating artificial materials that mimic natural stone. Some of these procedures correspond to methods still used today in industrial chemistry and materials science. Others describe effects that modern researchers have not reproduced, either because the descriptions are incomplete, because the necessary materials are no longer available, or because the procedures require knowledge that the texts themselves do not provide. The Arabic authors, like their Greek predecessors, often wrote in deliberately obscure language, using symbolic vocabulary and allegorical frameworks that protected their techniques from casual readers while remaining intelligible to trained initiates who already understood the basic principles. This practice of deliberate obscurity creates enormous difficulties for modern interpretation. When an Arabic text describes dissolving the stone of the philosophers in the water of life, is it using symbolic language for a spiritual transformation? Or is it providing coded instructions for a real chemical procedure using substances known to the original readers by names we can no longer identify? The answer is almost certainly both, depending on the text and the author, but distinguishing allegorical passages from practical instructions requires a depth of contextual knowledge that we simply do not possess. We are like archaeologists trying to reconstruct a building from scattered bricks, able to identify individual components but unable to determine how they originally fit together. The transmission problem extends beyond the Mediterranean world. In China, historical texts describe stoneworking techniques that parallel the accounts from Egypt and the Andes in ways that cannot be explained by cultural contact or diffusion. The Huainanzi, a philosophical text compiled during the 2nd century before the Common Era, describes methods for softening jade, a mineral even harder than granite, through the application of specific substances that the text identifies by names no longer understood. Later Chinese sources describe similar techniques applied to other stones, and the archaeological record includes jade artifacts of such delicacy and precision that their manufacture seems to require either superhuman patience or access to methods that reduce the hardness of the material. Chinese jade carving traditions have remained continuous to the present day, unlike the broken transmission chains of other cultures, but modern practitioners report that certain techniques mentioned in historical texts can no longer be performed, that knowledge has been lost even within traditions that maintained institutional continuity. If knowledge can be lost within unbroken traditions, how much more completely can it disappear when the traditions themselves are destroyed? The Inca quipu system presents a particularly haunting example of lost technical knowledge. These knotted cord records, made from cotton or camelid fibre with elaborate patterns of knots, colours and subsidiary strings, were used throughout the Inca Empire for accounting, census data and historical records. Spanish chroniclers who observed quipu readers at work describe their ability to extract detailed information from the knots, reading the cords as fluently as a European might read a written document. But the Spanish, suspicious of indigenous record-keeping and eager to suppress competing knowledge systems, destroyed the vast majority of quipu and prohibited their use. Of the approximately 600 quipu that survive today, scholars have successfully decoded only the numerical portions, understanding how the knots represent quantities while remaining unable to interpret the non-numerical content that the cords apparently also conveyed. If the quipu contain technical information, recipes for stoneworking compounds or procedures for monument construction, that information remains locked in a code we cannot read. The destruction of indigenous knowledge systems was not incidental to the Spanish conquest, but central to it. Colonial administrators understood that controlling information meant controlling populations, and they systematically eliminated the specialists who could read quipu, interpret astronomical observations, or practice traditional technologies. Within a generation of the conquest, techniques that had been maintained for centuries were gone, surviving only in fragmentary form in the accounts of chroniclers who often misunderstood what they were recording. The pattern repeats across conquered territories worldwide. Technical knowledge is fragile because it requires continuous transmission through training, apprenticeship, and practice. Written records alone are insufficient because texts cannot convey the tacit knowledge that practitioners acquire through years of hands-on experience. Even when texts survive, the practical ability to interpret and apply them depends on communities of practitioners who maintain the living tradition of their use. When those communities are disrupted, when the practitioners die without training successors, when the social structures that support specialized knowledge collapse, the knowledge itself can disappear so completely that later generations do not even know what has been lost. The Emerald Tablet, a cryptic text attributed to the legendary figure Hermes Trismegistus, represents perhaps the most famous example of alchemical writing in the Western tradition. Its opening phrase, "as above so below," has become a mantra of esoteric philosophy, and its dense symbolic language has inspired centuries of mystical interpretation. But some scholars have argued that the Emerald Tablet originated as a practical technical document, its symbolic language not mystical obfuscation, but the specialized terminology of craftsmen describing real chemical processes. The references to separation and conjunction, to dissolution and coagulation, may describe actual procedures for processing minerals, procedures that became unintelligible when the technical traditions that understood them were lost. This interpretation remains controversial, but it raises the possibility that other alchemical texts, dismissed for centuries as mystical nonsense, may contain fragments of genuine technical knowledge waiting to be recognized by readers who approach them with appropriate expectations. Modern attempts to reconstruct ancient stoneworking techniques have produced partial successes that suggest the basic principles may be recoverable, even if the specific procedures remain elusive. Joseph Davidovits, after proposing the geopolymer hypothesis for Egyptian pyramid construction, spent decades attempting to replicate the proposed methods in laboratory conditions. At his Geopolymer Institute in France, he demonstrated that limestone could indeed be reconstituted from crucite powder mixed with appropriate binders, that the resulting material exhibited properties consistent with natural limestone, and that the process required only materials and techniques available to ancient Egyptian builders. He produced sample blocks that reproduced many of the anomalous characteristics observed in pyramid samples, the variable density, the air bubbles, the microstructural features that natural limestone does not exhibit. But Davidovits could not replicate everything. The casing stones from the pyramids, the precisely fitted outer layer that originally covered the structures with a smooth white surface, showed characteristics that his laboratory samples did not match. Some component was missing, some catalyst or additive or procedural step that the ancient builders knew, and he did not. Despite decades of refinement, his geopolymer reproductions remained approximations, convincing in many respects but distinguishable under careful analysis from the original materials. The gap between what he achieved and what the ancient builders achieved represents the distance between theoretical possibility and practical mastery, the difference between understanding that something can work and knowing exactly how to make it work. Similar gaps emerge in other replication attempts. Jean-Pierre Protzen, after his experimental archaeology at Ollantaytambo, concluded that Inca stoneworking was achievable using conventional tools, but acknowledged that his results fell short of the finest examples he was trying to reproduce. He could produce fitted surfaces using stone hammers and patient labour, but he could not match the precision of the best Inca work done. The curved surfaces and sub-millimetre tolerances that characterise the most impressive examples. Something was missing from his methods, some technique or treatment that the original builders employed, and he did not know. He speculated about the possibilities: thermal treatment to soften stone, chemical application to alter surface properties, but he could not identify the specific procedures that would close the gap between his reproductions and the originals. In 1999, the television program Nova organised an ambitious experiment to test conventional theories of pyramid construction. A team of archaeologists, engineers and workers attempted to build a small pyramid using only tools and techniques believed to have been available to ancient Egyptian builders. The results were instructive but not entirely supportive of the conventional narrative. The team succeeded in quarrying, transporting and positioning limestone blocks, demonstrating that the basic operations were achievable with ancient technology. But they worked with blocks far smaller than the largest pyramid stones. They had access to modern engineering knowledge that ancient builders did not, and their pyramid was a miniature structure that avoided the scaling challenges inherent in building at monumental dimensions. The experiment showed that pyramid building was possible in principle, but it did not demonstrate that the specific methods proposed by conventional archaeology could actually produce the specific results visible at Giza. The problem of scale haunts all attempts at replication. Laboratory experiments that succeed with small samples do not automatically scale to monumental applications. Chemical reactions that proceed cleanly in controlled conditions may behave unpredictably when applied to multi-ton masses. Techniques that work with specific materials from specific sources may fail with superficially similar materials from different geological contexts. The ancient builders who produced the monuments we struggle to explain were not working in laboratories with purified reagents and precise instruments. They were working with variable natural materials under field conditions, adapting their techniques to specific circumstances, drawing on generations of accumulated practical wisdom that enabled them to succeed where modern researchers with superior theoretical knowledge continue to fall short. The missing variables may be numerous and interrelated. If stone softening techniques relied on botanical compounds, the specific plants may be extinct, their cultivation knowledge lost, their preparation methods undocumented. If the techniques required specific minerals, the ancient sources may be exhausted, the geological context altered by thousands of years of weathering and human activity. If the procedures demanded specific timing, specific temperatures, specific sequences of operations, the practical wisdom necessary to manage these variables may have been lost when the practitioners who possessed it died without training successors. A missing piece of knowledge makes reconstruction more difficult, and the cumulative effect of multiple missing variables may render complete reconstruction impossible even in principle. The central tension of modern research into ancient stoneworking is this: we can demonstrate theoretical possibility while failing to achieve practical reproduction. We can show that geopolymers exist, that plant-based acids affect stone, that ancient texts describe techniques we recognize as chemically plausible. We can produce laboratory samples that exhibit some of the characteristics of ancient materials. We can identify mechanisms by which the observed effects could have been produced, but we cannot build what the ancients built. We cannot match their precision, their scale, or the specific material signatures they left behind. Something remains missing, some practical knowledge that bridged the gap between theoretical possibility and monumental achievement. Perhaps future research will close this gap. Perhaps undiscovered texts will provide missing details. Perhaps ethnobotanical investigation will identify the specific plants and preparation methods that ancient builders employed. Perhaps archaeological excavation will reveal workshop sites where stoneworking procedures can be reconstructed from physical evidence. Or perhaps the knowledge is truly lost, irretrievable not because it never existed, but because the conditions necessary for its preservation were destroyed before modern inquiry began. The stones remain, fitted together in ways we cannot replicate, displaying surfaces we cannot explain, challenging us to admit the limits of what we understand about what human beings have accomplished and forgotten. On the Bolivian Altiplano, at an elevation of nearly 4,000 meters where the air is thin and the cold cuts through even the heaviest wool, lie the scattered ruins of a site called Pumapunku, a name that translates from the Aymara language as the Gateway of the Puma. The ruins are not extensive by the standards of major archaeological sites, covering only a few hectares of windswept highland, but what remains there has troubled researchers since the first European explorers documented the site in the 16th century. Massive blocks of red sandstone and andesite lie strewn across the landscape as if scattered by some catastrophic force, but these are not rough boulders torn from bedrock. They are precision-machined components, cut with angles and grooves so regular that they appear to have been produced by industrial equipment rather than human hands working with Stone Age tools. The famous H-blocks of Pumapunku feature interlocking shapes machined to tolerances measured in fractions of a millimeter, surfaces flat to within the accuracy of modern laser measurement, right angles so precise that they do not vary across the length of cuts extending for meters. Drill holes penetrate the hardest stone in perfectly circular bores that show no evidence of the spiral scoring that would result from rotational drilling with abrasive compounds. Internal corners meet at angles so sharp that they appear cut rather than ground, a feat that would require tools harder than the stone being worked, tools for which no archaeological evidence exists. The mainstream archaeological explanation attributes Pumapunku to the Tiwanaku culture, which flourished in the region between approximately 300 and 1000 of the Common Era, but this attribution raises more questions than it answers. The Tiwanaku possessed no written language, no metal tools capable of cutting andesite, and according to conventional understanding, no technology that could produce the precision visible in the surviving blocks. The site itself shows evidence of catastrophic destruction, perhaps by earthquake, perhaps by flood, perhaps by deliberate demolition, with the machined components scattered and tumbled as if the structure that they once comprised was violently disassembled. What remains is not a building, but a puzzle. Individual pieces whose original configuration we can only guess, whose purpose we cannot determine, and whose manufacture we cannot explain. Thousands of kilometers away, in the Bekaa Valley of modern Lebanon, stand the ruins of a temple complex that the Romans called Heliopolis, and that today bears the name Baalbek. The Roman structures are impressive enough, massive columns and decorated friezes that represent the height of imperial architectural ambition, but they rest on a foundation that predates the Roman presence by unknown centuries and that poses engineering challenges that Roman technology could not have addressed. The foundation platform of the Temple of Jupiter incorporates 3 stones known as the trilithon, each weighing approximately 800 tons, cut with precision, transported from a quarry nearly a kilometre away, and lifted into position at a height of 7 metres above ground level. No Roman crane, no system of ropes and pulleys documented in Roman engineering texts could have lifted such masses. The largest Roman cranes, according to Vitruvius and other ancient sources, were capable of lifting perhaps 20 tons under optimal conditions, a fraction of the weight that the trilithon builders routinely manipulated. And the trilithon stones are not even the largest at the site. In the quarry from which they were extracted lies an even more massive block, the stone of the pregnant woman, estimated to weigh over 1,000 tons, cut on 3 sides as if prepared for transport but never moved. Nearby lies another partially excavated block discovered only in 2014, estimated to weigh nearly 1,050 tons, the largest workstone ever identified anywhere in the ancient world. These stones were not merely lifted, they were precisely positioned. The trilithon blocks fit against each other with joints so tight that the typical mortar gaps visible in Roman construction are entirely absent. The surfaces where the blocks meet show no evidence of adjustment, no marks of tools used to trim them into fit after positioning. Either they were cut so precisely that they mated perfectly without adjustment, or they were somehow made adjustable after positioning, softened or shaped in place through methods that no conventional explanation can provide. The question of who built the Baalbek foundation has never been satisfactorily answered. Roman sources refer to the temple as ancient even in their own time, attributing its earliest construction to the Phoenicians, or to even older civilizations whose names had been forgotten. Archaeological excavation has produced no definitive evidence of the builders' identity or their methods, only the stones themselves, too large to move with any known ancient technology, too precisely fitted to have been positioned by trial and error. On Easter Island, in the remote southeastern Pacific, the famous Moai statues have drawn attention and speculation since European contact in the 18th century. The carved stone figures, some standing over 10 metres tall and weighing many tons, were transported from the Rano Raraku quarry to platforms around the island perimeter through methods that remain debater. But it is not the statues themselves that present the deepest mystery. It is the pukao, the cylindrical top knots of red scree stone that once crowned many of the moai, each weighing between 2 and 12 tons, somehow lifted and placed atop statues that were already standing. The logistics of pukao placement have resisted satisfactory explanation for decades. The statues stand on elevated platforms, their heads at heights that would require significant scaffolding or lifting apparatus to reach. The pukao are heavy and awkwardly shaped, cylinders that would tend to roll rather than slide, composed of a different stone from the statues themselves and quarried from a different location. Some researchers have proposed that the pukao were rolled up earthen ramps and tilted onto the statues, but this would have required ramps of enormous length to achieve manageable angles, ramps whose construction would have left physical traces that do not exist. Others have proposed that the statues were laid flat for pucao installation and then erected together, but this would have required lifting combined weights exceeding 50 tons in some cases, using nothing but rope, wood, and human and muscle on an island with limited timber resources and a population that probably never exceeded 15,000. The simplest explanation remains that we do not understand how the pucao were placed, that some method available to the Rapa Nui people escapes our reconstruction. The oral traditions of Easter Island describe the statues as having walked to their platforms, animated by spiritual power called mana that resided in certain individuals or was invoked through specific rituals. Modern researchers have interpreted this tradition metaphorically, proposing that the statues were rocked from side to side in a walking motion that gradually moved them forward, and experimental attempts have demonstrated that this method can work with replica statues of moderate size. But the walking interpretation does not explain how the pucao were lifted to the heads of already standing statues, and the traditions themselves make no distinction between the movement of statues and the placement of their top knots, suggesting that both operations may have employed methods we have not identified. In Japan, near the city of Takasago in Hyogo Prefecture, lies a megalith known as Ishi no Hoden, the Stone Treasure House, a roughly rectangular block weighing an estimated 500 to 600 tons, carved from the surrounding bedrock, but never removed from the quarry. The surface of the stone shows characteristics that have puzzled researchers since systematic study began. Portions of the surface appear vitrified, transformed into a glassy layer as if extreme heat had been applied, melting the outermost molecules before they cooled into a smooth reflective finish. Similar vitrification appears on megalithic structures in Scotland, on ancient hill forts throughout Europe, and on stonework in South America, always unexplained, always attributed either to natural weathering processes that do not typically produce such effects, or to post-construction fires that would not have burned at temperatures sufficient to melt stone. The Ishi no Hoden is carved with precision that seems inconsistent with its apparent age and the tools supposedly available to its creators. The faces are flat, the corners are square, the proportions are regular in ways that suggest deliberate geometric planning. Yet the stone was never moved from its quarry, never employed in any structure, never finished for whatever purpose its carvers intended. Something interrupted the work, leaving behind a monument to ambitions or capabilities that we cannot fully reconstruct. In Delhi, India, stands a pillar of iron that has resisted corrosion for over 1600 years in a climate that should have reduced it to rust within decades. The Iron Pillar of Delhi, erected during the Gupta Empire in the early 5th century of the Common Era, rises more than 7 meters above ground level and weighs approximately 6 tons. It is made not of modern stainless steel but of wrought iron, a material that under normal circumstances corrodes readily when exposed to moisture and oxygen. Yet the pillar shows only the faintest traces of rust, its surface protected by a thin layer of iron hydrogen phosphate that formed naturally, but that requires a specific composition and manufacturing process to produce. Modern metallurgists who have analysed the pillar have determined that it was made from iron with unusually low carbon content and unusually high phosphorus content, a combination that creates conditions favourable for the formation of protective surface compounds. The iron was forge-welded from many smaller pieces, a process requiring temperatures and techniques that the supposed technological level of 5th century India should not have permitted. The pillar has been studied for over a century, and while we now understand the chemistry that protects it, we do not fully understand how ancient Indian metallurgists achieved that chemistry with such consistency across a structure of such scale. The knowledge required was clearly available to them, but it was not documented in any surviving text, and the technique itself was apparently lost, as later Indian ironwork does not display the same corrosion resistance. The pattern that emerges from these scattered sites is troubling in its consistency. Across continents separated by oceans in cultures that had no documented contact with each other, the same anomalies appear. Stonework to precision that exceeds what their known tools could achieve. Surfaces that appear vitrified or melted. Joints fitted without gaps. Masses transported and positioned without evidence of the infrastructure such operations would require. The hardest local stones chosen consistently, as if the builders were deliberately selecting materials that would resist conventional working methods. If these similarities resulted from cultural diffusion, from techniques spreading along trade routes or through migrations, we would expect to find the intermediate examples, the sites where techniques were developing or adapting, the evidence of transmission from culture to culture. But the archaeological record shows no such continuity. Puma Punku stands isolated in the Andes, his precision machining appearing without predecessors and leaving no successors. Baalbek rises in Lebanon with no comparable sites nearby that might represent earlier or later stages of the same tradition. The Moai of Easter Island were carved by a population that arrived from Polynesia with no apparent tradition of monumental stone sculpture, and that developed their techniques in one of the most isolated locations on Earth. Either the same methods were invented independently multiple times, in cultures that faced similar challenges and arrived at similar solutions, or some pattern of transmission existed that left no trace in the archaeological record as we currently understand it. The problem of independent invention is that it requires multiple cultures to solve the same difficult problems in the same ways, to discover the same non-obvious techniques, to develop the same sophisticated capabilities without contact or communication. This happens occasionally in human history, as with the independent invention of agriculture in multiple world regions, but it typically occurs when the underlying problems are simple and the solution space is constrained. Independent invention becomes less plausible as the techniques in question become more sophisticated, as the number of variables increases, as the gap between known capabilities and demonstrated achievements widens. The precision stonework visible at sites around the world represents exactly this kind of sophisticated technique, one where independent invention strains credibility without explaining the absence of developmental stages, the suddenness with which the capabilities appear, or the completeness with which they disappear from cultures that supposedly invented them. What makes the pattern even more troubling is how the cultures themselves describe the origin of their knowledge. The Inca did not claim to have invented their stoneworking techniques. Their oral traditions, recorded by Spanish chroniclers before the last practitioners died, consistently attributed the knowledge to an earlier time, to ancestor figures who possessed capabilities that later generations could only partially reproduce. The stones were made tired, the traditions say, softened by the methods known to the old ones, shaped while they were workable and then allowed to return to hardness. This was not a claim of human invention, but of human inheritance, of techniques received from sources that the Inca themselves could not fully explain. Egyptian traditions follow the same pattern. The god Thoth, credited with giving humanity writing, mathematics and architecture, was not described as inspiring human discovery, but as directly transmitting divine knowledge. The Edfu building texts, inscriptions on the Temple of Horus at Edfu that describe the mythological origins of Egyptian temples, speak of the followers of Horus, semi-divine beings who preceded the pharaohs and who established the sacred patterns that later builders maintained but did not originate. The texts describe these earlier builders as possessing knowledge that was given, not invented, transmitted from a previous age rather than developed through human effort. The temple architecture of Egypt, with its precisely oriented foundations and complex astronomical alignments, was not the product of human innovation according to Egyptian understanding. It was the faithful reproduction of divine models, maintained through generations of scribes and priests who copied what they had received. Polynesian traditions echo the same theme. The knowledge necessary for oceanic navigation, for temple construction, for the carving of stone and wood was not discovered, but inherited from divine ancestors who walked the earth in an earlier age. The manner that animated the Moai of Easter Island was not human power, but spiritual force derived from connection to these ancestors, invoked through rituals that maintained the link between present and past. When the rituals failed, when the connection was broken, the power was lost, and tasks that had once been achievable became impossible. The islanders who greeted European explorers in the 18th century could not explain how the Moai had been moved and erected. The knowledge was gone, remembered only in traditions that spoke of walking statues and divine power that no longer flowed through human hands. The Mesopotamian tradition, though geographically distant from these other cultures, follows the same structural pattern. The Sumerian king lists describe kingship descending from heaven, an institution that was given rather than developed, transmitted from divine sources to human recipients. The Anunnaki, the council of gods who governed the world before the flood, were credited not with inspiring human achievement but with directly establishing the foundations of civilization, foundations that humans subsequently maintained, copied, and gradually forgot how to extend. The technical knowledge embedded in Mesopotamian astronomy, mathematics and architecture was not attributed to human genius but to divine teaching, to me or divine decrees that contained within themselves the patterns by which civilization operated. When those patterns were lost, through flood or conquest or simple forgetting, they could not be reinvented because they had never been invented in the first place. They had been received, and when the receivers failed to transmit them, they disappeared. This consistent pattern of inheritance claims across unconnected cultures poses a puzzle that conventional explanations strain to address. If ancient peoples invented their own techniques, why did they so consistently deny their own creativity? If their traditions were merely mythology, why did the mythology take the same form across cultures with no documented contact? If the knowledge was always human, why did humans in so many places insist that it was not? One explanation is that inheritance claims served social functions independent of their historical accuracy. Attributing knowledge to divine or ancestral sources enhanced its authority, made it resistant to challenge, and justified the power of those who claimed to understand and transmit it. Priests and kings who controlled access to sacred techniques derived legitimacy from that control, and inheritance traditions reinforced their position by placing the knowledge beyond human origin, beyond human questioning, beyond the possibility that anyone else might claim equal authority through independent achievement. This functional explanation has merit, but it does not explain why the same strategy would emerge independently in cultures that faced different social conditions and that had no model to imitate. Another explanation is that the traditions preserve genuine historical memory, distorted by time and retelling but reflecting actual patterns of knowledge transmission that operated in the deep past. If technical knowledge was once more widely distributed and was then lost through catastrophic events that disrupted the social structures necessary for its preservation, the survivors might well describe what remained as inherited from a previous age. If the knowledge came from cultures or populations that no longer existed, that had been destroyed or absorbed or simply forgotten, later peoples might describe it as coming from gods or ancestors, using the conceptual frameworks available to them to explain origins they could not trace. If the techniques were never independently reinvented because independent invention was never actually what happened, if instead fragments of earlier knowledge were preserved and adapted by successor cultures who lacked the context to understand their full original scope, then the inheritance claims would reflect historical reality rather than mere mythology. What we can say with confidence is that the pattern exists. Across continents, across millennia, across cultures with no documented contact, the same themes recur. Knowledge was given, not discovered. Techniques were inherited, not invented. The builders of the great monuments did not claim credit for their own achievements, but attributed them to sources beyond themselves. The present was diminished compared to the past, and what was possible in the previous age was no longer possible now. Either this represents a universal human tendency to mythologize the past, to imagine golden ages that never existed, and divine teachers who never taught, or it represents memory, corrupted and fragmented memory, but memory nonetheless, of knowledge that was once real and is now lost. The stones themselves offer no answer to this question. They sit where they were placed, fitted together with precision we cannot replicate, showing surfaces we cannot explain, monuments to capabilities we cannot reconstruct. They do not tell us whether their builders were gods or humans, whether the techniques were divine gifts or human discoveries, whether the knowledge was lost through catastrophe or simply forgotten through neglect. They tell us only that something was achieved, something that required knowledge we do not possess, something that left traces across the world in cultures that had no apparent connection to each other. The silence of the stones is the silence of a question that refuses to be answered. If multiple cultures independently describe themselves as inheritors, rather than inventors of their most advanced techniques, if the same pattern appears in Egypt and Peru and Polynesia and Mesopotamia, if the archaeological evidence shows sudden emergence of sophisticated capabilities without clear developmental stages, and then equally sudden disappearance without clear successor traditions, then either we are dealing with a universal psychological tendency that shaped mythology in identical ways across unconnected cultures, or we are dealing with memory, fragments of a history that predates the records we can read, echoes of a world that operated under rules we no longer understand. The conservative interpretation is that the pattern is psychological, that humans everywhere imagine golden ages and divine teachers because such imaginings serve social functions and satisfy deep psychological needs. The radical interpretation is that the pattern is historical, that the golden ages were real, that the divine teachers were real in some sense. We have not adequately conceptualized that the knowledge was real and has been lost. Neither interpretation can be proven from the evidence we currently possess. The stones remain, and the traditions remain, and the questions they raise remain unanswered, waiting for someone to find the key that might finally unlock their meaning. In the year 48 before the Common Era, Julius Caesar's forces set fire to ships in the harbour of Alexandria, and the flames spread to the warehouses lining the docks, and from the warehouses to the buildings beyond, and somewhere in that conflagration, according to ancient sources whose reliability we cannot fully verify, a portion of the great library of Alexandria burned. How much was lost in that fire, and how much survived to be dispersed or destroyed in subsequent centuries remains a matter of scholarly debate. What is not debated is that the library once existed, that it contained hundreds of thousands of scrolls representing the accumulated knowledge of the ancient Mediterranean world, and that today we possess only fragments of what was once preserved there. We know the names of works we cannot read, authors we cannot quote, discoveries we cannot verify, because later writers referenced them, cited them, argued with them, preserving in their own texts evidence that something once existed that no longer does. The loss of the Library of Alexandria has become a symbol for a broader pattern of knowledge destruction that haunts human history, the pattern by which what one generation builds the next generation loses, the pattern by which technical achievements that seem permanent prove fragile, the pattern by which the accumulated wisdom of centuries can disappear within a single generation when the conditions for its transmission are disrupted. We tend to imagine knowledge as cumulative, as a ratchet that clicks forward with each discovery and cannot slip backward, but this imagination is a product of our particular moment in history, and a moment when printing presses, digital archives, and global communication networks create an illusion of permanence that earlier eras did not enjoy. For most of human history, knowledge existed only in living minds and in physical objects that could be burned, buried, or simply neglected until they crumbled into dust. The techniques necessary to preserve knowledge were themselves knowledge that could be lost. And when the librarians died without training successors, when the scribes forgot how to read the scripts their predecessors had written, when the priests who understood the rituals were killed in wars or plagues, the knowledge they carried vanished with them. Roman concrete provides perhaps the most instructive example of how sophisticated technical knowledge can disappear completely from a civilization that considered itself the pinnacle of human achievement. The Romans built structures from concrete that have endured for 2,000 years, harbour walls that still resist the Mediterranean waves, domes that still span distances that would challenge modern engineers using modern materials. The Pantheon in Rome, constructed in the 2nd century of the Common Era, features an unreinforced concrete dome, 43 metres in diameter, that remains the largest of its kind ever built, a structural achievement that no one attempted to equal for nearly 2 millennia after the fall of Rome. The Romans clearly possessed sophisticated understanding of how to formulate concrete for durability, how to proportion the volcanic ash and lime and seawater that together created a material that actually grew stronger as it aged, chemically binding with its environment in ways that modern concrete does not. Yet this knowledge was lost so completely that when Renaissance architects wanted to build domes, they had to develop new techniques from scratch, working without any understanding of how the ancients had achieved what they had achieved. It was only in the 20th and 21st centuries that material scientists analysing Roman concrete samples identified the specific chemical processes that gave the material its remarkable properties. And even now, with full understanding of the chemistry, we struggle to replicate the results at industrial scale. Damascus steel tells a similar story. For centuries, swordsmiths in the Middle East produced blades of legendary quality, steel that held an edge longer, resisted breaking better, and displayed distinctive surface patterns that no other metallurgical tradition could match. Crusaders who encountered Damascus blades brought stories back to Europe of weapons that could cut through European steel, and the reputation of Damascus blades became legendary, the standard against which all other edged weapons were measured. Then, sometime in the 18th century, the technique was lost. The specific ores required may have been exhausted. The trade routes that supplied the raw materials may have been disrupted. The families that passed the knowledge from generation to generation may have died without heirs. Whatever the cause, the result was absolute. No one could make Damascus steel anymore. Modern metallurgists have spent decades analysing surviving blades, identifying the carbon nanostructures and vanadium carbide particles that give the steel its properties, but replication has remained elusive. We understand what makes Damascus steel special, but we cannot consistently produce it, because understanding the chemistry is not the same as knowing the craft, because the tacit knowledge that guided the hands of the ancient smiths cannot be reconstructed from the analysis of their products. Greek fire, the incendiary weapon that defended the Byzantine Empire for 7 centuries, represents perhaps the most complete example of deliberate knowledge concealment leading to total loss. The Byzantines guarded the formula for Greek fire as their most precious military secret, restricting its manufacture to a small number of specialists who worked under conditions of extreme security. The weapon was devastating, a liquid fire that burned on water, that could not be extinguished by conventional means, that terrified enemies who had no defense against it. For hundreds of years, Greek fire gave the Byzantines a decisive advantage in naval warfare, allowing them to destroy enemy fleets that would otherwise have overwhelmed Constantinople. Then the Byzantine Empire fell, and the specialists who knew the formula died or disappeared, and the secret they'd guarded so carefully became a mystery that modern researchers have never conclusively solved. We have medieval descriptions of Greek fire in use, accounts of its effects and its deployment, but the formula itself was never written down in any document that survived, and centuries of speculation have produced theories but not certainty. Some researchers propose naphtha-based compositions, others suggest calcium oxide compounds that ignite on contact with water, but no proposed formula fully matches all the characteristics that historical sources attribute to the weapon. The knowledge was too well protected, too closely held, too dependent on the individual specialists, whose deaths ended the tradition they embodied. The Spanish conquest of the Inca Empire demonstrates how deliberately targeted destruction can eliminate knowledge systems far more quickly than gradual neglect. The conquistadors did not merely conquer territory and extract resources. They systematically dismantled the institutions that preserved and transmitted Inca knowledge. The Quipucamayos, the specialists who could read and create the Quipu records, were identified as threats to colonial authority and suppressed. The Akalas, the chosen women who maintained textile traditions encoding information in patterns and colours, were dispersed into the colonial economy. The temples where astronomical observations were recorded and where technical knowledge was taught were demolished and their stones repurposed for churches. Within a single generation of the conquest, the knowledge systems that had taken centuries to develop were gone, leaving only fragments in the accounts of chroniclers who did not understand what they were witnessing, who could not read what they were describing, who preserved evidence that something had existed, without preserving the something itself. The quipu that survive in museum collections around the world remain largely unreadable, their information locked in a code that died with the last Quipucamayos, their knotted strings testifying to a knowledge system sophisticated enough to administer an empire, but not robust enough to survive the death of its practitioners. What the Spanish destroyed intentionally, ecological change has destroyed incidentally. The botanical knowledge that indigenous peoples accumulated over millennia, knowledge of which plants could treat which ailments, which compounds could affect which materials, which combinations produced which effects, this knowledge was embedded in ecosystems that no longer exist. The Amazon rainforest contains species that have never been catalogued, compounds that have never been analysed, potential applications that have never been explored, and each year thousands of square kilometres of this forest are cleared for agriculture and ranching, eliminating species before they can be studied, destroying knowledge before it can be recovered. These stone softening plants described in Andean traditions may still exist somewhere in the diminished forests of the eastern slopes, or they may be extinct, casualties of habitat destruction that erased them from existence before modern botany could identify them. We cannot know what we have lost because we do not know what was there to begin with. The catalogue of extinct species grows longer each year, and with each extinction vanishes not only of a life form, but every potential use that life form might have served, every compound it might have produced, every technique it might have enabled. The problem of recovery haunts every attempt to reconstruct lost knowledge. When we analyse Roman concrete, we are working backward from finished products to the processes that created them, inferring causes from effects, hypothesizing procedures that might have produced the results we observe, but multiple procedures might produce similar results, and the specific procedure that the Romans actually used might differ in crucial ways from our best guesses. When we try to replicate Damascus steel, we are constrained by the raw materials available to E, which may differ from the raw materials available to the original smiths in ways that our analyses cannot detect. When we search for stone softening plants, we are looking for species that may no longer exist, or that may exist but not in the locations we are searching, or that may require preparation methods we have not tried. Recovery is not impossible, but it is not guaranteed, and the longer knowledge remains lost, the more difficult recovery becomes, as the physical evidence degrades, as the oral traditions that might provide clues fade from memory, as the ecological and geological context that supported the original techniques continue to change. The stones at Sacsayhuaman do not care about our difficulties. They sit where they were placed, fitted together with precision we cannot achieve, showing surfaces we cannot explain, monuments to capabilities we have not recovered. The walls still stand after 5 centuries of earthquakes, their joints still tight enough to refuse a knife blade, their curves and angles still mated with tolerances that challenge our best measuring instruments. Whatever technique created them worked. Whatever knowledge guided the hands of the builders produced results that have outlasted empires, outlasted religions, outlasted the very memory of how they were achieved. Perhaps the technique was botanical, plant extracts that softened stone temporarily, allowing it to be shaped by hand before it rehardened into permanent form. Perhaps the plants are extinct now, or rare, or require preparation methods that have been forgotten. Perhaps the technique was chemical, geopolymer reactions that cast stone from slurry, knowledge preserved in alchemical texts that we have dismissed as mystical nonsense because we lack the framework to read them as technical manuals. Perhaps the technique was something else entirely, something we have not imagined because our assumptions about what was possible for ancient peoples have narrowed the range of hypotheses we are willing to consider. The stones offer no answers. They simply exist, patient and unexplained, challenging each generation to account for them, to fit them into narratives that keep proving inadequate. We can measure them precisely and fail to explain how such precision was achieved. We can analyze their surfaces and find anomalies we cannot interpret. We can compare them to our own capabilities and acknowledge that we fall short, that with all our technology, all our understanding, all our accumulated knowledge, we cannot build what the ancestors built. Perhaps that is the deepest lesson the stones teach. Knowledge is not permanent, capability is not guaranteed. What one generation achieves, another generation can lose, and what is lost may never be recovered. The assumption that we stand at the summit of human achievement, that our ancestors were primitive and our descendants will surpass us, this assumption is not supported by the evidence of the stones, which testify to capabilities that exceed our own in at least some domains, capabilities that were achieved and then lost, that flourished and then vanished, that left behind only monuments and mysteries. The walls of Sacsayhuaman will still be standing when our certainties have crumbled, when our explanations have been replaced by new explanations that will themselves be replaced, when the questions we ask have given way to questions we cannot yet imagine. The stones are patient. They have been waiting for 500 years already, waiting for someone to remember what was forgotten, to recover what was lost, to understand what once was known. They will wait as long as necessary. They have nothing but time.